All right, let's jump into Unit 3, Module 15, Evolutionary Psychology. So here are your vocab 3. Learning objectives. Here they are. Pause it if you would like to know what you are supposed to know. Evolutionary psychology. All right, here you go. Definition of evolutionary psychology is the study of evolution of behavior and the mind using principles of natural selection. So when you think evolutionary psychology, I want you to think natural selection, right? I'm sure you probably could have surmised that without me telling you that. So you do have to know the definition for natural selection. Those trait variations that contribute to reproduction will survive and will be the ones to be passed down. So if you need more support with natural selection and evolution, you should read these 4 main ideas here and pause them. But really, I think that a lot of you already know this, so I'm really not going to spend a lot of time on this. Essentially, certain traits are more desirable and more conducive to the environment. Those genes get passed down because of reproduction, and the ones that are not fit die off. Mutation is the final vocab for this module. So, and when those genes are passed down, any random error in the gene replication process, that is called a mutation, and that's what gives us change, which happens very slowly in evolution, of course. So, when we're talking about evolutionary psychologists are looking for, and this is important, evolutionary psychologists are looking for what makes us similar. Okay, so universal truths across the human species. Because in evolution, it's about what has gotten the species as a whole to survive. So these should be universally true. Now, compare that to Module 14, behavior geneticists. Behavior geneticists are looking to draw out the differences in human beings by using nature versus nurture and looking at those twin and adoption studies. So, some universal truths. Let's see. We're all shaped by natural selection. And for example, humans that were predisposed to eat poisonous or bitter tasting foods, those ones died off, and the ones that were predisposed to eat sweet and fatty and salty foods, those lived on, and hence now we have chocolate-covered bacon. Thanks, evolution. I've never tried it, actually. I don't think I want to. I kind of like them separate. Universal moral grammar. So this is the idea that evolutionary psychologists say that we have this universal moral compass. And so one example they talk about in your textbook is how in a scenario where there are 7 people in a room and there is a vent filling up with gas. People, when asked the question if they would be comfortable forcing someone into that vent to save the 7 people, a lot of people aren't really interested and willing to do that. However, they are much more, feel much better about it if the person falls into the vent and they just don't stop them from falling in and then saving the 7 people. So that's kind of that moral philosophical dilemma that you might have discussed in your morality class. And those are kind of universal truths to humans. Not all moral thoughts, but there are some, is the point. So I've already said this, we are biologically prepared for a world that no longer exists just because our technology, our society moves much faster than evolution. Evolution is slow. And so we have chocolate-covered bacon. So gender differences. So in evolutionary psychology, I want to start out with first, they get a lot of criticism for these views on gender differences, for for their views on sexuality, all of these things, because they're looking for what makes us similar and that it helps the species survive. And so some people kind of argue that it's a very it's like supporting like 1950s type mindsets, but they have like a reaction to the criticism. So I want to explain all that, but first I want to get into what their beliefs are before we attack them. So the BBC did a study of over 200,000 people in 53 nations, and they did some survey information and basically found that men have a stronger sex drive. They are more likely to see and perceive friendliness from the opposite sex as sexual interest when it might not be. And women are less likely with both of those things, and they are more focused on building relationships, whereas men are more focused on the recreational aspect of relationships. So, and not necessarily long-lasting relationships. Women are more interested in long-lasting relationships. So they say all of that is because of natural selection, because women are the ones who get pregnant and who have the offspring, and so they're looking for mates who will stay, who are mature, and can invest in that joint offspring. So according to evolutionary psychologists, natural selection has evolved amongst the human species to have these attractive traits for men seeking women. So youthful, smooth skin, and fertile appearing. And there's they connect that to the waist-hip ratio being ideal for pregnancy. And women seeking men, they're looking for mature, again, long-term relationship, offspring, all that. Dominant, bold, like strong, protective, affluent, again, can take care of, and potential long-term investment, as it keeps saying. So natural selection selects these traits because these are the ones that help the offspring, or help reproduction, which help offspring, blah, blah, blah. So, criticisms. So first, the biggest one that you do need to know is hindsight bias. So remember, hindsight bias is when you have the answer first, and you have the answers first, and you're going back and looking to explain. You're like, yeah, I know that's because of this, right? So evolutionary psychology is looking at right now, because that's their only option. They're looking at right now and saying, we are this way because of thousands and thousands of years of evolution. They're going from now back. And so what's wrong with that when we're talking about theories? Or what's not necessarily wrong because it's a theory, but what's difficult and where's the weakness in that? So yeah, like how do you disprove that, right? And how do you really show evidence for what they're talking about? There's also this aspect that they are blurring the lines between genetics and sociocultural impact. So remember our biopsychosocial model. So how can we really tell what those gender roles and what women are seeking in men or men are seeking in women? How do they don't account for cultural influence at all. And that's a factor, clearly, right? Like we keep talking about this biopsychosocial model. Again, lack of evidence, I already said that. So in response to the critiques on evolutionary psychologists say that, like, look, we are not saying that people are hardwired to be that way, that we're not capable of thinking and doing different than our ancestors and this natural instinct selection within us. Like, we are flexible, we are adaptable, we are responsible for our own decisions and actions, and how we came to be isn't how we ought to be. they don't have explanations for everything because not everything fits in their mold. So that's that. So again, ultimately, we redirect back to this biopsychosocial model, and we know that it's not just evolution. It's not just biology, which is basically kind of what they're saying. Well, they're saying nature and nurture, I guess, right? Because genes with the environment that they're in. But it's a constant interaction between these things. So our biology influences our psychological influences, it influences our socio-cultural influences, but also vice versa. Remember, we talked about molecular geneticists and geneticism and how the environment also leaves a fingerprint on our biology. So there's this whole interplay. So key takeaways from this module. It's pretty simple, pretty basic. So evolutionary psychologists use natural selection to explain why people choose the mate that they do. Again, how is that similar from behavior geneticists? They talk about how genes form us, but the environment shapes us. And you do need to remember the criticism that evolutionary psychology faces, particularly hindsight bias. The biopsychosocial model shows how we are this open and interactive system. So we are constantly evolving and developing because of the interplay of those three factors. All right, so that concludes our Mod 15. Easy peasy. See you next week. Next day, tomorrow, I don't know.